I didn't know that stepping into that office would change my entire perspective on trust and boundaries. From the moment I walked through those doors, everything seemed off. I'd spent weeks preparing for this interview. The position was perfect, the company reputable. But as I stood there, waiting to be called in, something about the silence around me sent chills down my spine. A man walked confidently toward me. His voice boomed as he greeted me warmly, his charisma filling the room. "Ah, you must be here for the interview. Right this way," he said. He was magnetic. You couldn't ignore his presence. Everything about him screamed confidence, maybe even too much confidence. I followed him into his office. His handshake lingered just a second too long, and his smile felt slightly out of place. I brushed it off. Maybe I was overthinking, but as the interview began, I realized this wasn't going to be like any other I'd experienced. The questions started out normal. He asked about my qualifications, past experience, and career aspirations. Standard things about my work history and where I saw myself in the future. But as we continued, I noticed something strange. "You have a very unique energy," he said, leaning forward slightly. "It's not just your resume that stands out. There's something about the way you carry yourself." I smiled politely, but his words felt more personal than professional. I told myself I was overreacting. After all, wasn't it a good thing that he saw potential in me? Then his questions started to veer off course. "Do you think your personality is part of your success? I mean, people must naturally gravitate toward you." I didn't know how to respond. Was this still an interview, or had it become something else entirely? I glanced at the clock on the wall. The minutes seemed to drag on endlessly. I tried to redirect the conversation back to the role, but every time I did, he would steer it back to me. Not my skills, not my experience, but me. There was something in the way he spoke, the pauses between his words, the way his eyes lingered just a second too long. It was subtle, but unmistakable. I tightened my grip on my resume folder. I started to feel trapped, like I was walking a tightrope. If I said something, would I blow my chances? But if I didn't, how far would this go? "You're quite impressive, you know," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Not everyone has this kind of presence, it's rare." It was then that I realized he wasn't complimenting my professional abilities. This wasn't about the job anymore. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. I knew I had to say something, but my mind raced with questions. How do you confront someone like this? What if I was wrong? What if I wasn't? Every instinct told me to get out of that room, but I also knew how much I needed this opportunity. The stakes couldn't have been higher. The questions started out normal, typical interview stuff. "Tell me about yourself. Where do you see yourself in 5 years?" But then he started steering the conversation into strange territory. "You've got a unique presence. It's rare to see someone who carries themselves like you do," he said. I smiled politely, but the compliment felt loaded. It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. "Do you think you're persuasive? Could you use your charm to win people over?" he asked. I wanted to focus on the job, but his words kept drifting away from anything professional. The air in the room was changing, and I couldn't ignore it. I tried to redirect the conversation, but every time I did, he found a way to circle back, not to my skills or experience, but to me. It wasn't just the words, it was the tone, the pauses, the way he looked at me. I realized I was no longer in an interview. I was in the middle of something far more personal and invasive. At some point, I knew I couldn't let it go on. I had to say something, but how do you confront someone who's in complete control of the situation? I sat there weighing my options. Should I stay quiet and endure, hoping the conversation would eventually turn back to the job? Or should I speak up and risk everything? I decided to start small, testing the waters. "I appreciate the compliment," I said, forcing a smile. "But I'd really like to focus on the role and how I can contribute to your team." He leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he smirked. "Oh, you're bold. I like that," he said. His response sent a wave of unease through me. He wasn't apologetic. If anything, he seemed amused by my discomfort. That was the moment I knew this wasn't a misunderstanding or a misstep. He knew exactly what he was doing. I tried to steer the conversation back to professional topics, but he continued to push boundaries. "You know," he said, "people with your kind of presence don't come around often. It's a gift. Have you always been this magnetic?" His tone was casual, almost playful, but the words felt heavy. I realized I was no longer in a professional setting. This was personal, and it was crossing a line. He started kissing me. He put his hand on my chest. I feel something which occur with me. Then he put his something big in me. I feel so much pain. I felt trapped. My mind raced as I considered my next move. If I left, I'd be walking away from a potential job, an opportunity I had worked so hard to secure. But staying felt unbearable. How much was I willing to tolerate for the sake of my career? I took a deep breath, gathering my resolve. "I think we're done here," I said, standing up. "Thank you for your time." He looked surprised, but only for a moment. Then he leaned back in his chair, his smirk returning. "You're walking away? Interesting choice," he said. I didn't respond. I turned and walked out of the room, my heart pounding. As I left the building, a mix of emotions washed over me: relief, anger, and a newfound sense of empowerment. Walking out of that room felt like reclaiming something I didn't even realize I'd lost. I realized that no job, no matter how promising, was worth sacrificing my boundaries or self-respect. It was a hard lesson, but one I knew I'd carry with me moving forward. That day I learned that no job is worth sacrificing your boundaries. It's easy to get caught up in the pressure, to think you have to tolerate behavior that makes you uncomfortable. But that's not true. We're taught to endure, to compromise, and to stay polite, even when the situation becomes unbearable. It's as if we've been conditioned to prioritize opportunities over our own well-being. But at what cost? As I walked away from that office, I kept replaying the events in my mind. Every lingering glance, every invasive question, every subtle manipulation, each one chipped away at my confidence until I finally decided to stop it. I realized then that the problem wasn't just him. It was the system that allowed people like him to thrive. I started reflecting on similar stories I'd heard from friends and colleagues. Stories of bosses who crossed the line, colleagues who used their power to intimidate, and environments where speaking up meant risking everything. These stories weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a larger issue. But there's power in recognition. By identifying the problem, I took the first step toward reclaiming my agency. I realized that no job, no opportunity, no dream is worth compromising your self-worth. And I want you to understand that too. If you've ever found yourself in a similar situation, know that you're not alone. There's strength in sharing our stories, in speaking up and holding people accountable. When we refuse to tolerate inappropriate behavior, we not only protect ourselves but also pave the way for others to do the same. It's not easy. Confronting someone in a position of power takes courage. Walking away from an opportunity you've worked hard for takes resilience. But in the end, standing up for yourself is always worth it. I hope my story inspires you to trust your instincts and to value your boundaries. Your worth isn't determined by someone else's perception of you. It's defined by how you perceive yourself. Let's start a conversation. Have you ever faced a situation where someone crossed the line? How did you handle it? Share your story in the comments. Let's learn from each other and build a community where respect and boundaries are prioritized. Remember, your voice matters. Speak up,